Hey guys, Edre here, and today I'm going to be doing a brand new album review. I'm going to be reviewing the new Paul McCartney album, McCartney 3. This is an album that I have been looking forward to for quite some time now, and to be fair, I've been trying not to get my hopes up too much, because at the end of the day, Paul McCartney is pushing 80, and I never really expect any artist to be releasing their best material when they're 80. That being said, Paul McCartney is a Beatle, so he always has some really high standards. It is very easy for people to really overhype and underhype Paul McCartney's solo albums. On one hand, we get a lot of Beatles fans who instantly praise his solo material no matter what, simply because of the Beatles connection. Whereas there's a lot of people who don't like the Beatles that instantly write it off. In my opinion, I fall somewhere in the middle. I definitely look forward to it, but I also kind of going into it knowing that the chances of it being as good as a Rubber Soul or as a Sgt. Pepper's is not the highest. But there is usually always something to like in Paul McCartney's solo work, even if it's not his best. And I wasn't a huge fan of Egypt Station, so going into this, all I really kind of hoped for was that he improved off of the things, off the flaws that I had with Egypt Station. Going into this is the third installment in his self-titled series, and he does all the instrumentation. That's sort of the gimmick of his self-titled albums. And for the most part, that got me a bit excited, because I feel like my biggest problem with Egypt Station was, overall, the arrangements, the more pop-friendly compositions and everything. I was kind of looking forward to the much more raw and gritty McCartney 3. And for the most part, that is exactly what I got. All the instrumentals are done by McCartney himself, and many of the songs here have a much more raw and acoustic sound than his previous album, which is something that I really appreciate. However, tracks like Seize the Day still have that kind of pop-friendly side of Paul McCartney's, which isn't inherently a bad thing. The Beatles have always had a poppy sound to them, and even much of Paul McCartney's material has as well. So don't take that negatively. That's not really a big complaint. That is just something I have observed. Musically, the much more raw. This is a much more raw and acoustic album. And not every song on here is acoustic, but there's much more natural instrumentation than some of his previous albums, such as Egypt Station. And while I do enjoy the opening track, Long-Tailed Winter Bird, I feel like the song itself, like when you actually boil the song down to its core and take away all the instrumentation in just the core of it, I don't feel like it really goes anywhere. And unfortunately, that does drag it down for me. I feel like it's a very interesting instrumental piece in many ways. The vocals are honestly not that existent here. It's a nice instrumental, but I just don't think the song itself really leads anywhere, unfortunately. However, at least it was executed decently. I will say, though, some of the more piano-based tracks on here, such as Women and Wives and Deep Deep Feeling, sorry, I think land much more fluidly onto this album, and actually I think pack a bigger punch. Well, I do feel like Women and Wives doesn't really lead anywhere, and I feel like, unfortunately, just like the first track, it's a really nicely composed track, but I feel like the track itself doesn't really go anywhere. Deep Deep Feeling, I think, is one of his best solo tracks that I've heard in a while. I think it's a bit more abstract and it's a very interestingly composed track. It's a very long track, which is something I thought was interesting on this album. But I think it was executed much better than the other one, and I just think it was one of the more interesting listens on this album. I really liked the way the strings came in and the bit more sporadic drumming throughout. I thought that was a really nice touch. There's even a bit of a blues rock influence on Slide-In and Lavatory Lil, which is all to be expected from Paul at this point. And I definitely deeply apologize for my dogs barking for absolutely no reason. But I will say Slide-In definitely has one of the more Beatles-esque sounds to it, and definitely a bit more of that raw, earlier Beatles sound to it, which is something I enjoyed quite a bit. The track Deep Down is probably my favorite on here, other than Deep Deep Falling. It's funny they both have deep in the title. It just has a really nice fat groove to it that I think is missing on a lot of tracks here. And I think Deep Down has one of his best vocal deliveries. I think the chord progression is very nice on here. Definitely one of the highlights. However, I do think overall many of the tracks on here just don't really leave that lasting of an impact, and especially when I put it into the context of his entire discography, not only solo and with Wings, but also with the Beatles. It's very hard to compare this album. In my opinion, it pales in comparison to the likes of some of the greatest Beatles albums or even some of Paul's best albums in the 70s, and unfortunately, that does drag this album down quite a bit for me. I still enjoy the album a lot, but I don't really think it compares much to some of Paul McCartney's older solo material. Lyrically, it's pretty standard material that you would expect from Paul McCartney at this point, singing about looking back onto the past with aging, as well as a fair amount of love songs, a fair amount of about love, as well as even some satirical tones on Lavatory Lil. But there's also a bit of abstract writing on here as well, such as the opening track, which I cannot help but notice a bit of Who influence on that song, the see me, feel me type vocal niches that he kind of adds on that opening track. I personally think it was an interesting touch. I can take it or leave it, but it was one of the things that really stuck out to me right away. And vocally, I want to simply cover the fact that Paul McCartney is much older now, and I think even more so than the last record, his vocals sound much more aged and seem a bit more weaker and more frail than they used to be. And that's not inherently a negative thing, because at the end of the day, he can't help it. He's just getting older. And I think for a guy his age, he actually still sings pretty well. I just don't think he sings as well as he used to, simply because he is much older. Overall, I know this is a bit of a shorter review, but I thought it was a good listen, and I did enjoy the album overall. It's just, when I really compare this to the rest of the albums in his discography, from the Beatles, from Wings, from his solo material, it's hard to really compare it. And it's really hard to even hold a candle to it. Because as much as I did get some general enjoyment from this album, this definitely sounds like the album that you'd expect from a person who is like 78. Because at the end of the day, he sounds a bit more frail here. The instrumentals aren't really pushing any new boundaries for him. These are all kind of stuff he's experimented with before. And while they are relatively well executed, this isn't really a quintessential album in his discography, in my opinion. Don't take that the wrong way. I still enjoyed it. I just really was not blown away by it. And at the end of the day, I just think it is hard to compare an album from Paul McCartney in 2020 to anything he put out over the past 60 years. But at the end of the day, it was still a fun album. It's very reassuring to know that he's still putting out music. It's just, I did have a fair amount of issues with it, but most of that just came from the fact that he is much older. It really is not his fault. And for an album coming from a guy who's as old as he is, it was relatively enjoyable, and I do recommend people listen to it. With that being said, I was left somewhere in the middle with it. However, I liked it more than I disliked it, and I have settled on giving it a strong 6 out of 10. Now, to some people that might seem very low, and I understand that it seems very low, but in my opinion, that's actually a good review, because anything above a 5 is good, anything below a 5 is negative. And for anybody that's as old as Paul McCartney to get an album in a 6 or higher range is actually pretty good, in my opinion. So yeah, I have settled on giving this a 6, which means I genuinely enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I wasn't blown away by it, but I thought it was alright. It definitely met expectations, and I definitely had a fun time listening to it. With that being said, Paul McCartney, McCartney 3. Strong 6 out of 10. Before I end this video, though, I just want to say I might take a little bit of a break from doing actual reviews, because quite frankly, a lot of big artists don't release albums during the tail end of the year, mainly due to Christmas and all that. And that being said, if Playboi Carti does put out Whole Lotta Red, I might get around to reviewing that. But my main focus right now will be actually putting together the final draft of my best albums of 2020 list. I will be doing a full video on that either towards the end of this month or in the beginning of January, and I might also make the worst albums as well. And I will also make a blogger page to go along with that, so you could actually read more in-depth my thoughts on each of the albums that make the list. That being said, Paul McCartney, McCartney 3, strong 6 out of 10, pretty good for a guy who's 78. That is it for now, and goodbye.